going to ask if Jimmy Lai is allowed to have any communication with the outside world.
So that's a great question. Well, I have to say, as his biographer, it was very tough writing a biography of somebody that you can't communicate with. So he can have very limited communication. He's allowed to meet 2 to 4 times a month for half-hour meetings. They could be, I guess, with anybody who gets permission. In fact, it's with his wife and his children, who several of whom are still in Hong Kong. It seems that authorities have stopped letters from reaching him. I know I have not communicated with him because of the whole national security law. I mean, what he's being charged for basically is talking to foreigners, and far more important people than me, people like Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. But this whole issue of collusion, even his son, Sebastian, who's living in Taiwan, can't go back. His father wasn't able to go to Sebastian's wedding, hasn't been able to see Sebastian's granddaughter, or Sebastian's daughter, his granddaughter. Sebastian couldn't visit Hong Kong without risk of arrest. The Hong Kong government has attacked him simply for standing up for his father. You think of that, trying to rip apart families like that. So, yeah, the short answer is sure, he can talk to his wife, Teresa, through plexiglass, incredibly monitored conversations, 2, 3, maybe 4 times a month. For a half an hour, and then at the end of that, it's finished. He gets limited reading material. As I say, it's illegal, but they seem to have shut the flow of letters. We can't exactly track that because you don't know what's getting through and what's not. So very, very restricted. Of course, he's able, in limited cases, to talk to his lawyers and have access to them, such as at the moment when the trial, his national security law trial, is just resumed.
He's a Catholic. Do you know if he's been given access to the Eucharist?
Excellent question. He's now been denied that in recent months.
Really?
But he has an international legal team that's working on his behalf, and they surfaced that issue, which is a tremendous concern to his family. And the Hong Kong government came back with this really weird response saying that he hadn't asked for it, and no priest had asked to give him communion, and nobody wanted to cause any trouble. It's like, come on, you know how many there are many Catholics in Hong Kong. He's very, very close to Cardinal Zen, who's aging and would have a difficult time, but was able to administer Holy Communion in the prison. And I'm sure there are many priests who'd be willing to go in to meet with Jimmy and give him the Eucharist. And the answer is no. And then the Hong Kong government is kind of admitting it and kind of lying about it. It's completely illegal, and it's inhumane because his Catholic faith and the love of his wife and family, and I believe the support of people around the world is really what's keeping him going. So I mean, it's cruel beyond belief to deny him communion.
It's so crazy what's happened in the last few years with Hong Kong courts. Right, because in the beginning, and I mean even the after the handover, the first decade plus of Hong Kong under the one country, two systems, it still had a pretty independent court, and it seems that starting around 2019, 2020, especially after the national security law, things just went crazy. Like how is it that judges who presumably have been educated in the Hong Kong legal system for many, many years are now willing to preside over a case with what I can only be described as trumped up charges. I think collusion with foreign forces and collusion to publish seditious materials.
Yeah.
Something like that. So how does that happen in the Hong Kong court system so quickly and so brutally?
I think that's a question that we're going to be trying to puzzle out for many years. It does not speak well to the integrity of the judges who are seeing these cases. It's interesting. So you mentioned the national security law. This was a pivotal piece of legislation that came in on June 30th, 2020. It basically criminalized dissent. It took away, there are many rights, such as right to trial by jury. That was guaranteed in a document that the Chinese communists themselves promulgated, the so-called Basic Law. It's a kind of mini constitution that, underpinned the handover to Chinese rule. So, trial by jury, the right to pick your own lawyer, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. I mean, all the things that we would take for granted in a Western society, one by one, they're just knocked down by the national security law. So Jimmy wanted to have his own lawyer from abroad, which is a common practice in Hong Kong. It's a small jurisdiction, and you want to get the best lawyer you can, especially if money is no object. And he tried to hire a guy engaged at King's Counsel, Tim Owen, who'd practiced in Hong Kong, was trying a case in Hong Kong. The government just rewrote the rules with the help of Beijing to deny Jimmy his lawyer, and then they canceled Tim Owen's visa and couldn't come to Hong Kong anymore. The right to trial by jury. Well, national security law says, well, if jurors wouldn't feel safe, like as if the defendant were going to do something, then we can just have trial by judges. That's not too good, because trial by jury is one of the great innovations of common law jurisdiction. I mean, you should have the right to be judged by your peers and not by some judges in a hanging court. Oh, and so they didn't just take any judges in Hong Kong. They have a secret panel of national security law judges. We don't know if there are, 10 of them or 1,000 of them. It seems to be a pretty small number. It's the same judges who keep handling these national security law cases. So they pick quislings, they pick compliant. I mean, they really pick despicable people who will just, sacrifice their principles. I mean, these judges have acted as prosecutors, really, in many of these cases. The question is like, how did this happen? I guess you can always find a few weak people. I mean, very few of us are going to have the principles and the heroism of somebody like Jimmy Lai. Most of us would like to think we at least have some principles, but it's always possible to find some people who, for reasons of career advancements. I'm one of these guys, of these judges, had actually been reprimanded in the past. He was just such a, so obviously prejudiced against a democracy protester. And so you pick weak people, you pick compliant people, and then you say it's all rule of law, when it's pretty clear that they're acting under the explicit or implicit instruction of Beijing. They have about a 97% conviction rate in the national security law cases. And, it's impossible to imagine that Jimmy wouldn't be convicted. So I don't know if that really answers your question, except to say, excuse me, I don't think there's really anywhere in the world in the last century that's gone from 60 to 0 in terms of freedom without like a war or a revolution or something like this. They've just done it. The guys are still wearing their wigs, the guys and the women. It still looks like it's a British court or something. And yet the principles that they have, they've undercut are just, it's almost beyond it's almost beyond belief. It's so fast, so harsh, that you can't even really comprehend it. I'll just finish with one final example. Jimmy got, I think it was 14 months in prison because he attended a commemoration of the June 4th Tiananmen killings. Every year those were held in Hong Kong. It was the only place in China where we could hold them. The last one that was freely allowed to be held was 2019. I was there. Some of you might have been there. 160,000 people or some big demo or commemoration, very somber vigil. The next year, because of COVID, the government would not give permission. Jimmy decided to go to Victoria Park, where the commemoration is always held, got out of his car, refused to speak to the press, refused to make a statement. He lit a candle, he said a prayer, silently got back into his car. For that, he was convicted of inciting a riot. Can you imagine inciting a riot? And the judges said, well, you're a famous person. Basically, people respect you. Therefore, you coming incited a riot. There was no violence. There was no riot. But that's the kind of so-called justice that we have in Hong Kong. And this is the Hong Kong government says that Jimmy and others are being convicted according to law. This is complete nonsense. It's rule by law. There's no more rule of law in Hong Kong.
It reminds me of when that blind lawyer Chen Guangchen was convicted of blocking traffic or whatever. It's just like, sure, you've incited a riot. There was no riot. There was no protest even, right? So it was just, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they just make stuff up. I mean, it would be kind of like Alice in Wonderland meets Kafka meets, George Orwell's 1984. I mean, you can't imagine that this is really happening. I mean, yeah, I'll stop there. I'll let you ask some more questions.
That's actually a really good way to describe China. Alice in Wonderland meets Kafka meets 1984. That's horrifying.